It is May 28th, 1992. And Vedran Smilovic, lead cellist of the Sarajevo Opera Orchestra, steps into the street, fully dressed in shirt and tails, as if ready for the opera house. But no applause greets him. Rather, the only sound in the air is the sporadic crackling of gunfire. At this moment in time, the city has already been mostly destroyed, burned and shelled with mortars in the civil war that has lasted now for months and will last more for years, and which has turned ethnic groups who used to be kindly neighbors into murderous enemies. The streets are completely empty for fear of being caught in the crossfire. Just the day before, 22 people had been killed by a mortar while lined up to get bread at a local bakery. And it is into this scene that Smilovic returns. He had been there on that day. He had tended to the wounded. But today, he comes not with bandages, but with his cello, dressed for a performance. He sits on a plastic chair in the empty street, and he raises his bow. He proceeds to play Albini's Adagio in G minor, often recognized as one of the most melancholy pieces of classical music ever composed. He plays it there in the midst of the rubble, in the midst of the fires and the bullets whizzing around him, somehow unaffected by them. He plays Albini. And he plays it again the next day, and again the next. He plays it every day for 22 days, one for each victim of the senseless violence tearing apart his home. He plays for no one and for everyone, and somehow manages to remain untouched by the violence filling the same streets in those same moments. Soon, throughout the city, other musicians join him. Out of their windows, in the dangerous and dark streets, come violinists and violists and the sound of wind instruments. They come forth to play an elegy, and they all play Albini. Now, this tender scene is described in the opening pages of Susan Cain's book, Bittersweet: How Sorrow and Longing Make Us Whole. And she uses this episode, which is real, by the way, and eventually became the subject of both a book and a film, to enter into the question of what sorrow helps us to do. What's with sad music, she asks. Why do we sometimes feel that we just must submerge ourselves in melancholy? Should Smilovic not have played something happy to lift his people's spirit, or something bombastic to move them to action? But no, Cain says, and this is the thrust of her book, he made the perfect choice in Albini. She argues that there is something particularly powerful about what she calls bittersweetness, about being able to hold together two completely opposite emotional realities at the same time, like the beauty of music and the ugliness of war, like the sadness of loss and the gratitude we have for what was lost, like the delight of a perfect moment and the sharp awareness of its ephemerality. Right? Bittersweetness. Have you felt it? This is the feeling that might find you welling up in tears watching your child or grandchild play happily on a normal day. Because it's not just the feeling of joy in that moment, but also some sense of loss, that it's going by too fast or that we won't have forever like this. Now, this bittersweetness can be, in Cain's opinion, at least both a habit and a general disposition that we have in life. If you are feeling right now the inclination to go home immediately after this and search YouTube for Albini's Adagio and listen while crying your eyes out, you may already have this well-developed disposition within yourself. And Cain believes that there is something emotionally healthy about this, and that perhaps the capacity to reclaim a bittersweet state of mind might help us individually and culturally to thrive in this strange and sad time of history in which we live, one that today feels not so different than Smolovitch's. But how do we do that? How do we do that? Well, for me, the answer has come, in part at least, to read more poetry. You know, we're here in this series on poetry, and honestly, when I started this sermon, I thought I absolutely cannot top last week, in which Tim invited us to consider the spiritual implications of our parietal lobe. But I can tell you on a personal note that poetry is what has helped me to develop a habit of bittersweetness, one which I believe has sustained me spiritually through some very difficult seasons. Over the years, as I've come to rely more and more on the language of poetry to express my deepest devotion, I have noticed how it has beckoned me again and again into a spirit of bittersweetness, of both and, of joy and sadness, of the eternal and the momentary. Because so much of life is so multifaceted, isn't it? You know, our grief, whatever it is, much of the time is tied up with love. And our happiness is tied up with worry about its fragility. And our joy is informed so profoundly by our mortality. As the poet William Blake notes in his wandering auguries of innocence, joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. For me, poems like this, and the others that I love, name these intersecting truths that make up our human experience. Truths that I know are there, but which I find I am often happy to avoid. I imagine you know that our culture is known to be relentlessly optimistic, with an overemphasis on happiness, on turning that smile upside down, on soldiering on. But I believe, and Cain agrees, that there is something powerful about developing the ability to dwell with what is, even if that is difficult and contradictory. Leaning into that complexity, leaning into the bittersweetness of it all is not only a healthy path, Cain says, but also a countercultural one. And I have found that poetry is the language that delivers that invitation right to my heart, bypassing the encultured, rational part of me that would try to shuffle me toward happiness before I had the chance to feel it mingled with sadness. All of which makes me wonder if we haven't been getting Ecclesiastes a bit wrong all this time. I know you're familiar with this one. We hear it at funerals, and the iconic song by the Byrds, For Every Season, turn, turn, turn. But when we hear it, and I know this is usually true for me, I think we tend to imagine these seasons as being distinct, as if God had said, this season is for mourning, and when that's done, we'll start the season for laughing. Or, let's do the season for tearing down first, obviously, and then we'll wrap it up and start the season for building up. But I wonder, and maybe you can wonder with me too for a moment, if each of these dichotomies might be imagined as an invitation to do both things at once. That God has made a time for laughing and weeping. That God has made a time for mourning and dancing. for both, because God is in both. Because God is in both, not just in succession, but in both at once. And that even in our acknowledgement of that is an affirmation of God's presence. Because beneath all the bittersweetness is the same thing. And Cain comes to this conclusion too. Beneath all of it is longing. Is longing. Longing for things to be different. Longing for more time. Longing for a way where there is no way. It's part of the great ache that we share with all other humans. And there are secular responses to this ache and longing, and there are also spiritual ones, because what is more spiritual than longing? Longing for God has been at the center of the life of faith forever. And it is quite notably the subject of most of our biblical anthology of poetry, the Psalms. We long for the sacred. We long for peace. We long to be free. We long to be wrapped in the arms of love. We long for just a little more time. We long, in the words of the beloved Christian thinker C.S. Lewis, for the world from which we came. We are filled with longing for God, even as, and this is the bittersweet paradox of faith, we know God is there in our longing. And while I know all of this might sound a bit melancholy, it's not meant as a discouragement. Because longing, and this is another insight that comes from Cain, is a powerful thing. Listen to what she writes about longing. Longing is momentum in disguise. It is active, not passive, touched with the creative, the tender, the divine. We long for something or someone, we reach for it, we move toward it. The word longing derives from the Old English langian, meaning to grow long, and the German langen, to reach or to extend. The word yearning is linguistically associated with hunger and thirst. In Hebrew, it comes from the same root as the word for passion. In other words, the place you suffer is the same place you care profoundly. Which means that, at their worst, bittersweet types can despair that the perfect and beautiful world they long for is forever out of their reach. But at their best, they try to summon it into being. This is still Cain. Bittersweetness is the hidden source of our moonshots, our masterpieces, and our love stories. It's because of longing that we play moonlight sonatas and build rockets to Mars. It's because of longing that Romeo loved Juliet and that Shakespeare wrote their story and that we still perform it centuries later. It's because of longing and the deepest desire of the human hearts that Redran Smalovich conjured into being what he played with his cello in the streets of a war-ravaged city, the longing of our hearts. And I guess the question that these poems and this story lead me to is, can we do that too? In some small way. I mean, I think any of us who have read the paper recently or even looked around can acknowledge that the world we live in is so tender and scary just now. It is filled with terror, and uncertainty reigns. And it would be reasonable, in light of this, to want to stay inside, safe as we can, at home with our fears. But what if there was something? What if we allowed something, a poem, a song, a prayer, to give voice to our bittersweetness, to articulate our longing in a way that drew us out, that helped us to be brave, to turn that longing into something creative, generative, into a song, into some service, into some act of love for this hurting world. If we were to make some small testimony against the death-dealing forces of our age, what would it sound like? For Smilovich, it was a cello. For our friend Jesus, it was a cross. And for us, well, that's up to you. Offer these words in the name of the God who created, redeemed, and sustained us always. Amen.